Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's talk, Pronunciation, Teaching, Key Concepts and Technique. My name is Paola Boucher. I am the Senior Program Coordinator of the Texas Language Center, and I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Charlie Nagle. Throughout this year, the Texas Language Center has hosted speakers who value linguistic diversity in their approach to teaching, translating, and speaking languages. In our talk today, Dr. Charlie Nagle contributes significantly to this discussion by sharing his work on pronunciation instruction in the classroom, focusing on how students may achieve intelligibility, that's hard for me, as opposed to strictly native-like pronunciation, which clearly I don't have, in their second or third language. Dr. Nagle holds a PhD in Spanish linguistics from Georgetown University. He's also an associate professor in the Spanish and Portuguese department, and his research focuses on quantitative methods for studying speech perception and production, along with individual differences in language learning. His work has been published in venues such as Language Learning, Studies in Second Language Acquisition, and the Modern Language Journal. His research has been supported by the Fulbright Program and the National Science Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Charlie Nagle.
Thanks. Okay, want to start by thanking, obviously, the Texas Language Center and Paula for helping organize this event and for inviting me. Pronunciation is so cool. That's what I'm here to talk to you about, how the multidimensionality of pronunciation, which also comes into play in the classroom when we're talking about diversity, right? There's a social dimension to speech. There's a motor dimension, literally in terms of what we produce. And there's also the perceptual side. So we're going to talk more about the perception and production components and helping people improve their perception and production from a pronunciation angle, and less about the social dimension, but that's always in the background. Happy to talk about that too if you want. Okay. So here's our roadmap with potential time targets for me. Emphasis on potential. I will do my best. I want to talk about accents a little bit, and then talk about the learning and teaching framework, pronunciation learning and teaching framework that we subscribe to nowadays, the most prominent one, maybe the only one. Then spend some time reflecting on what sorts of challenges do people face when learning to pronounce another language, an additional language. Again, that can be in perception in terms of what they're hearing, but also production, what they're producing. We think more about production when we're talking about pronunciation, but the perception is a really important component as well. And then spend most of our time talking about techniques. I'm going to present to you some techniques that I use that hopefully you would be able to recycle, and then we'll spend some time brainstorming together potential techniques that you know of, that you already use, applying the techniques, adapting the techniques to that I present to your context as well. Okay? So accents are super salient, right? They're probably the first thing we notice. It only takes maybe a syllable or two, a word, and we start to think, oh, where's this person from? What type, what dialect do they speak? Is English their native language or their first language? And so on. And I purposefully chose this little pithy meme of sorts, speak cat in 4 weeks, because there's a bunch of, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say bad actors, but profiteers around accents and accent reduction, accent elimination, speak like a native speaker in 5 minutes a day, none of which is possible, by the way, or necessary. Even besides possibility is the necessity angle. So I think we need to have that in the background and sort of think about how we can unpack some of that baggage that we've inherited as language learners of orienting towards a native speaker model at all times, which implies on some level a deficit model, right? Not recognizing ourselves as bilingual, multilingual individuals and the multi-competence that we have, including how that manifests in pronunciation. I'm kind of fascinated by this thing that, like the series of videos on YouTube. Typically it's a native speaker reacting to people speaking their native language. And typically it's celebrities they're judging, like how good is so-and-so Spanish or French or Thai or whatever. It's in many languages, and I've watched many, many videos, probably more than I should have at this point. And they do things like this, right? Like who speaks better Chinese? Grading people from God tier. Do I have my pointer? Yeah, God tier down to faking it, right? In terms of Chinese. This is like a well-known, I guess, Chinese professor, instructor. And there's actually somebody else on this video that also participates in this grading system. I just noticed train wreck. I'd forgotten about that one. And then, you know, same here, exact same thing, grading from, I guess, I'm not sure what S stands for, superior perhaps, but ranking people in terms of this scale, and then the ever-present native speaker who gets to do the ranking. And, you know, these videos aren't malicious per se, like it's meant to be fun, tongue-in-cheek, and, you know, some of these, like, this is like Sheldon from Big Bang Theory speaking a few words of Mandarin on the show or something. So like, don't think there's any malicious intent here, but I think it really reflects our fascination or obsession with accents, the way people speak. And by the way, that's one of the primary metrics that people use to judge who has achieved this like native speaker status, right? There's an identity component there, but it's how well do you speak, and that's oftentimes most evident in terms of our pronunciation. Pronunciation is almost indelible at a very young age. So the sounds that we're exposed to from a very young age exert an indelible influence on our ability to learn other languages, or how we perceive and produce other languages. Okay? So I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about that theory, although a huge body of work in applied linguistics and second language learning began with accent work, right? Because there was that fundamental question of how important is age? And beyond a certain age, can you acquire a language to native-like competence, where native-like competence was often framed in terms of accent, right? And we've moved away from that. So I want to talk about the ways our thinking has changed or evolved. And by the way, there is something really interesting about accent from a cognitive perspective, right? Maybe not so much from a teaching perspective, but cognitively it does reveal something about the bilingual or multilingual mind, right? So that research is important. A few facts about accents. Everyone has one. Could be native or non-native. It depends how we construct it. You know, native, non-native is a distinction we've had for a while, and there's some problems with that terminology, so I'm going to do my best to avoid it and say first and second, or first and additional language instead of native and non-native. They're super salient. We already talked about this. We notice accents all the time, even minor deviations in pronunciation. I remember I was at a friend's house recently and somebody outed themselves as Canadian, and I said, oh, that's weird, you don't have the Canadian vowels. Literally within a sentence after that, I heard the Canadian vowel. I was like, oh, okay, there it is, I hear it now. And we can adapt to them. So accents are malleable, and so is our ear. We can adapt to different accents, and in fact, we have to all the time, right? No two people speak exactly alike. And the same person doesn't produce things in the same way all the time. Okay. So let's talk a bit about second language accents, and just first of all say it's completely normal and expected for our first language to affect any additional languages that we learn. And we can extend that too. We can say if we know a second, third language, all of those languages are going to kind of affect our learning of additional languages. Accented speech does not always affect understanding or communication. I'm sure all the time we're interacting with people in our daily lives and we perceive an accent of any variety, right? But we still understand that person most of the time. There might be some little blips here and there, but most of the time we understand them just fine. And so really what we're trying to say is some accent features do affect understanding or can affect understanding in certain contexts, and some don't. And the salient ones aren't always the ones that affect understanding. So a classic example in English is the sound, like in the word the, which some people, depending on their first language, depending on the languages they know, might produce as da, like da book or something, or za book. But you know what? That doesn't really affect understanding. It's super salient. We notice it. To the point where learners sometimes obsess about it too and say, oh, I can't produce that, in the same way that Spanish learners say, I can't produce R. And they like downgrade themselves as Spanish speakers because they haven't mastered the canonical trill. But you know what? It's not that important from a communicative perspective. Okay. So some facts about second language accents. So I'm a big fan of baking shows and baking, and this is Great British Bake Off, season 15, Nellie. A participant named Nellie, and I'm going to show you a clip, and you have this on your paper. And if you don't have a paper, I don't have additional copies, so just kind of share, please. And I just want you to answer kind of a series of questions. Does she have an accent? Does Nellie, the person that we're talking about that's going to appear in this little TikTok GBBO clip, does she have an accent? How strong is her accent? How strong do you perceive it to be? Can you understand her? And how easy is she to understand? And I added an additional one on there, I think, which is, are you perceiving a native or a non-native accent? Perhaps. Uh-huh.
This as an American English speaker?
Whatever your ear hears, yes. Yeah. And that's an amazing point because it's part speaker, part listener, right? It's what you produce, but it's also what I perceive. So yeah, according to your perception. There are no right and wrong answers. Right? This is not a formal test. And by the way, this scale is going to be, the lower scores are going to be, yes, I'm hearing a very strong accent, whatever that means to you. And then very difficult to understand. And then the higher scores are going to be, you know what, I'm not perceiving any accent whatsoever. Very easy to understand. Okay, so let's watch this clip together.
I have a little bit experience with plaits. Brioche you do like this in my country. I got it nice and long, so we should see how I'm gonna plait it. I used my extra dough to make a little plait because I don't like the connection and I want her to finesse.
So you've elevated it to the next level?
Because it's finesse. One day he gonna say, Nelly, you did it.
I like this. Someone's
that's
plaited before
It's got a placid belt.
to cover up the join.
Yeah.
It's a lovely way of doing it. It looks very good. There's definition there as well.
I think that's lovely texture.
The colour, the definition, the plaiting, very, very good.
It's very hard for me to take compliments because all my life I wasn't good enough. And from Paul, the king of bread.
Well done, Nelly.
Well done, Nelly.
Thank you very much. It was the biggest compliment I ever could have.
Okay, so yeah, very endearing clip as well. Nellie's a much beloved member of season 15. So take a minute. You probably already did it kind of intuitively as you were listening. But I'll give you a minute just to think about it. I don't know if you noticed this, and I didn't plan this, but she's talking about dough, and the automatic subtitles detected though instead of dough. So this is literally what we were just talking about, but it's fine. She said though, something closer to though, but she was talking about dough, but we all understood that, right? It wasn't context completely disambiguated what she was talking about. So does Nellie have an accent? Yeah, right? Like I already said, we all have accents, so you can't speak without an accent. Like it's literally impossible. How strong would you say her accent is? From very strong to not very strong. Like what number would you give her? No right answers, just call something out. Like a 5. We love regression to the mean. Yeah, I'd probably say, 5, 6. Like it's pretty noticeable to me based on my ear. Can you understand her? Yeah. Yeah, you might have some difficulty. So that's where this comes in. How easy was it for you to understand her? Like if we didn't have the subtitles, which admittedly weren't perfectly accurate, how well would we understand her? Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, pretty easy. I'd say probably a 7, 8 for me. But I'm also like non-representative because I listen to accents all the time and it's part of my research. So it doesn't really matter where you fall on the continuum, right? It's just that sort of evaluative judgment of how much effort did I have, how hard did I have to concentrate? And by the way, we can all probably think of instances where we've been interacting with someone and we had to concentrate really hard to understand them. And that happens sometimes. And by the way, I don't think that's a bad thing. It's okay to have to it's okay to do your due diligence as the listener, right? And be like, well, let me pay closer attention. Let me make sure I'm understanding the person, okay? So that's Nellie. And by the way, we saw Paul and Prue. They were the judges. Paul and Prue have accents as well. Everybody does. They speak native accents of English, but they might not be perfectly easy to understand either, depending on how comfortable you are with their particular accent varieties, right? So this happens, it could be first language and non-first language speakers and so on. Let's talk about Giuseppe for a second. He was on Great British Bake Off season 12, and we're going to do the exact same thing for Giuseppe. And this is a famous clip, so you might have seen it before. Love using this clip. Okay.
Have you made baklava before?
I've never made baklava before. I've never made filo pastry before.
You haven't?
It's a massive hassle. Why would you? You just buy it.
It's a what? A massive...
It's a hassle.
Oh,
Hassle.
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 Oh my word, I genuinely thought you said something else there. A massive hassle. Please don't write in to complain.
Hassle.
Yeah, so, this clip went viral, and it was titled Giuseppe's Massive Blank, right? Because it was a viral moment. So this is an interesting instance, right, where there's sort of like a pragmatics issue going on here too, where you're not hearing the word that you think you're going to hear, but you're hearing something like that's pragmatically, socially very marked, right? So trying to say hassle, but hearing asshole, basically, right? So Giuseppe, does he have an accent? How strong is his accent on our 1 to 9 scale? For me, it's like a lot. He doesn't have as marked of an accent as Nelly. So I would probably put him towards the higher end in terms of not much of an accent. Can you understand him? Yeah. And even though, there was that little snafu with the H in hassle, because native phonology, that in Italian, that H wouldn't be there. Still pretty easy to understand, I think. In context, I don't know. I've also watched this clip a lot, so. But how easy would you say he is to understand? 8, 9, yeah.
Based on me saying that the first time, I also understood the other word before.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Because there was the H and then the stress pattern of the word was different. Exactly. So there were a couple little pronunciation things going on that together made us perceive something that we shouldn't have perceived and maybe didn't want to perceive. But I mean, these aren't the best examples, right? Because these people were already screened and selected for the show and presumably very easy to understand overall. And I certainly found them to be very easy to understand throughout watching the episodes. But we adapt. So even if they're harder for you to understand at first, you watch them for a little bit and you'll quickly come to understand them, right? And so this is what speech researchers do, applied speech researchers do all the time. And it's basically this framework that we're working within, and this is what you just did. So we didn't really evaluate actual understanding or intelligibility, because if we wanted to do that, I would have had you transcribe what they were saying. Not all of that, because that would have been a lot, but a little piece of it. Comprehensibility we did do. That's regardless of whether or not you understood them, how effortful was it for you to understand, right? And we typically do that with those rating scales like you did yourselves. And then accentedness or accent is pronunciation differences constructed from our perspective. So typically it's relative to a local dialect, right? It could be native or non-native, right? Exactly. So speech researchers were quite interested in this. And like I said, we started from a place of accents and foreign accents specifically in the 80s, 90s. There was a ton of work on that within the context of the critical period hypothesis. And then applied speech researchers said, hey, wait, hang on a second. What do we know about the relationships between these things? If somebody is really accented, how does that affect intelligibility? How does that affect comprehensibility? And so they did the same thing. They did what we just did. So in this case, they recorded second language speakers telling a story or responding to a prompt, something like that. It's usually telling a story to keep the content more or less consistent. and then they extract a clip and process it, and then they present that clip to listeners who transcribe it and rate it, just like we did minus the transcription part, because we didn't do that, okay? And so this is kind of from the first study, this is what they found, and this is from Monroe and Derwing, 1995, if you're interested. But first of all, I want you to notice that these are the comprehensibility and accent ratings for sentences that were transcribed with 100% accuracy. So there was no intelligibility issue whatsoever. Everybody understood the sentences perfectly as intended. And paradoxically, I'm not sure why, but lower scores are better here, okay? So like the way the scales were worded is not the way we just did it. But so you can see that there's a range of comprehensibility ratings, not at the higher end, but at the lower end. So it was perceived, these sentences that were perfectly intelligible were perceived as very easy to understand, but not perfectly easy to understand, because we've got 2, 3, 4, and a few people said 5. Okay. Notice the accent ratings, though, they're all over the place, from really strongly accented to basically not accented at all. Okay, so this tells us something, that we can understand something and understand it pretty easily, even if it's produced with an accent, right? Intuitively, that makes sense, because sometimes we interact with other native speakers, first language speakers, not from our dialect, and most of the time we don't have problems, right? Even though their speech is really different from ours. Okay. So what this tells us is that there's a pretty strong, if we dug down into more of their results, we would see there's a pretty strong link between intelligibility and comprehensibility. That makes sense, right? If you are able to transcribe something, it suggests that it's relatively easy to understand. There is a link between accentedness and comprehensibility, so more accented stuff tends to be a bit harder to understand, but the link is a bit weaker. And then the relationship between accentedness and intelligibility is pretty weak. So having an accent does not mean you're going to be unintelligible or have low intelligibility, right? Okay. And so this has become the framework, this has become kind of the framework for pronunciation learning and teaching nowadays, emphasizing intelligibility and comprehensibility over accentedness. And there's been some work going on. It started with English, right? English tends to take precedence in almost all L2 research, or has historically. That's changing. But now there's studies in Spanish, French, Japanese. There's probably studies in other languages. Admittedly, I haven't followed this research as closely as I used to. But now we have a growing knowledge base in different world languages about the relationships between these things and the types of pronunciation and grammatical, right? Because comprehensibility isn't just pronunciation, it's also grammar and things like that. The types of features that are likely to have an effect on intelligibility and comprehensibility. Okay, and so this is the intelligibility-based framework, which is sometimes framed as the intelligibility principle, where we're aiming for intelligibility, and really comprehensibility is lumped in with that as well, over nativeness, over trying to pass as native speakers or develop this native-like accent, which may or may not, some learners may have that as their goal, and that's okay, but I think as instructors we need to be prioritizing this intelligibility or comprehensibility principle, based on the fact that, like I just said, many accent features don't affect understanding, and a native-like accent is not needed for successful communication. We just saw that phrases, sentences that were transcribed with perfect accuracy had accent ratings all over the place. So people were understanding those speakers despite accents. Okay. And I would just say that intelligibility and comprehensibility are ethical and achievable goals, right? So native-like accent is not very achievable. Even if you subscribe to that being a possibility, bilinguals, multilinguals aren't a bunch of people lumped into one person, right? Our languages affect one another. That's completely natural. Okay. I'm going to speed up slightly because I realize my timing was way off, but I'm enjoying this conversation. So let's talk about some challenges right quick. And we're going to talk about perception challenges and production challenges, right? So sometimes people may not hear a difference between similar sounding words. So linguists, this is like minimal pairs, right, is what we're talking about. And so really differences between sounds like cat and cut, right, where there's a vowel difference, and that tends to be a big challenge for people who didn't grow up speaking English. People might not be accustomed to dealing with variation in pronunciation, so they might be used to hearing just one dialect, and so they're not used to people pronouncing things in different ways. And another problem people face is they can't recognize words in the speech stream, so it just sounds like a ton of gobbledygook coming at them. You know, they haven't learned how to recognize word boundaries in the language and what the cues to word boundaries are. Okay. Some examples. So like sheep versus ship tends to be hard. Cat cut I already gave for hearing the difference. Dialectal variation, there's this thing in English called the Northern Cities vowel shift. So that's where bag and beg tend to be produced as the same, with the same vowel in like Wisconsin, in like the Midwest, right, upper Midwest. So like my friend Katie doesn't say bag, she says bag. Or bagel. You know, I'm going to buy a bagel. Okay. So if you're not used to that, it can be difficult to process initially. A few examples from other languages. So English speakers tend to have trouble processing Spanish like verb morphology. So the difference between hablo and hablo. French nasal vowels are a classic example. Mandarin tones, like any tonal language for speakers of non-tonal languages. Okay. And so I'd like us just to take a few minutes to chit-chat with one another, maybe just 2 minutes. Some examples from the languages you teach. Are there, like, what are perception problems, right, in the languages you teach? Are there particular sounds or words that learners confuse or they think sound the same? And then bonus, if you have time, as an instructor, just taking a step back and thinking about how confusable those sounds actually are, right? So learners are having problems with them, but like in the landscape of your language, how confusable are those sounds? And I'll unpack that in a second. So take 2 minutes to talk to a partner about that.